I'd like to tell you a story about a road trip. A road trip that is 5 years in the making now. It's something I've been wanting to do since I left university, basically, and life kept getting in the way, I guess. But I recently had the opportunity to go do it, and the end result is some of the greatest photographs I've ever made in my life, in my opinion. The reason I felt the need to go on this trip is because I grew up in various places around Africa, and there's an idea of a cultural identity for a South African that I really never had an opportunity to experience, I think. And my ancestry is such that my family members were farmers, which is a contentious thing, potentially, to be in South Africa, but it is what it is, and that's the ancestry that I have. And to me, the idea of going and seeing what that was all about always had an immense appeal. Before we get into the video itself, I feel I do need to point out that there is an overarching perspective of South Africa from an outside view, that it is one of the most dangerous places in the world. And this is true, but it's quite specific in the manner in which it's dangerous. I mean, traveling alone is never a good idea in South Africa, really. You can be safe about it. I'd like to think I was quite safe about it as a local, with my understanding of the way that things are. And even then, you'll see through the course of this video that I end up in a very sketchy situation. The thing is, though, that South Africa is probably one of the most beautiful places in the world, and you're going to see that too. I just feel I need to point out, in case anyone gets the idea that they'd like to go do a solo road trip around South Africa, that there was a lot of preparation involved in this, and I was as safe as it is possible to be. The cameras that I brought with me were my Mamiya RB67 as a decent all-rounder, with the exception of things like fast-moving subject matter and on-the-fly compositions. For that, I brought my Mamiya 7 II, which also has the benefit of being able to shoot at somewhat lower shutter speeds without getting shutter shake as an issue. And I borrowed a Toyo 45A from my mate Chris to take some large format pictures, finally, since I've been saving the film up for years. And in terms of the film, I brought a variety of stocks, but ended up pretty much only shooting Kodak Portra 400 with some 160 that snuck its way in. And with that out of the way, this is the story of the biggest adventure I've been on in my life. Things started off very wet. The plan for the first day was to take a leisurely drive up to Van Wyksdorp and overnight there, and along the way make some images of the Karoo, because I'd been commissioned to make these images and don't normally really stop particularly frequently while I'm doing this drive, just because I'm on the drive with the goal of reaching a destination. Whereas in this case, as would be the case for the rest of this trip, I was on the drive for the goal of being on a drive and making some pictures. The drive from Cape Town to Van Wyksdorp is super dull for the first hour, normally. I mean, you're driving along the N1, it's a main road, but then as soon as you reach the Huguenot Tunnel, it turns into something else. The tunnel itself is always a bit of an experience to drive through. The ceiling lights kind of make it feel like you're in some sort of spaceship warp field type situation, and when you emerge on the other side, it does generally feel that way. On this day, though, unfortunately, the weather kind of made it a bit less exciting than it has the capacity to be, although it was still quite pretty. I hadn't perfectly figured out the Insta360 I borrowed from my mate Dune at this stage, though, so the clouds were a little bit blown out in the video because I hadn't realized it had an HDR function yet. Anyway, after a bit more driving, I decided to stop for the first time at a petrol station just before you reach Worcester. This petrol station is kind of a pilgrimage for Maya and I, because she always wants to stop there and I never want to, because it's just as the drive starts to feel like it's underway. On this day though, because I was out there to make pictures, I decided to stop there and see if there was anything worth looking at. And as it turned out, there was. There was a scene of this blue car that had broken down, unfortunately for them, but it was set up in sort of the perfect way for a broken down car scene, so I stopped and made a picture of that. And I think that moment was the first time it started to feel like I was properly on a trip to make pictures, because it was the first time of many on this trip that I stopped somewhere that I might not traditionally do. Shortly after that petrol station, you turn off into Worcester and nip through it to get on the road to Robertson. Normally, the landscapes start to get quite nice at this point, but on this day, once I left Worcester, I got absolutely nuked by a rainstorm. As it turned out, I decided to leave on the day where Cape Town had a historical rainstorm and flooding, and that was going to have repercussions down the line beyond just a bit of unpleasant driving, unfortunately. I decided that since I couldn't change the weather, I might as well try to make the most of scenes that could actually benefit from a bit of rain, which is why once I reached the Kochmanskloof Pass, I decided to stop there for the first time ever, I think, and I've probably driven through there about 40 times in my life, so this was a bit of a moment. The Kochmanskloof Pass is a spectacular piece of road. You're surrounded by mountains that have fascinating folds in them that took hundreds of millions of years to form, probably. And the centerpiece of it is a section of this mountain where someone decided to blow a hole through it. Once you've passed through this hole, you're officially on the R62, one of the more famous roads in South Africa that passes through a bunch of towns in the Klein Karoo. It's probably somewhat of an equivalent here to what Route 66 is in America. I found out, since passing through there, that you can actually get on top of that hole in the wall and have a view of the mountain from there. I didn't know this at the time, but since I know it now, I'm going to make a note to go back there at some point and see what it looks like. On this day, though, I cruised on to Montague. Basically, the reason I'm on this trip, which I've probably spoken about, is first off an assignment and second off a personal project. And as part of the assignment, there's little stops that the person wants me to go photograph along the way. And the first one was a tree on the corner of Barry Street in Montague, which is meant to be full of birds, but I think, given the weather, the birds are taking a rest. So I photographed the tree, because it is pretty pretty. And now I'm going to continue onwards. To Barrydale. It's normally a pretty beautiful drive. In this case, though, it was somewhat wet. So wet, in fact, that there was a little river just after I left Montague going across the road that just looked like a normal patch of rain going across that turned out to be about that deep, probably, and I hydroplaned quite spectacularly on it, which was a little bit horrifying, and I was a bit more wary of what looked like just normal puddles in the road after that. Because, I mean, you can tell normally when something is likely to hydroplane you, and it looks hydroplaney, and it'll have pooled somewhere, and you're like, I'm not going to drive through that section. But this was going across the whole road, and looked just like every other section of road that had a little bit of water going across it. So I learned my lesson there, and treated everything as if it was likely to hydroplane me from then on. I ended up stopping for a picture of some grass in the wind. The weather didn't really look like it was going to let up, and I decided to make a mission out of seeing, given the weather, if I could make the sort of picture I'd been wanting to make for a while, where you've got a bright foreground and heavy clouds in the background. This felt like a good first attempt. I don't know if it worked out exactly the way I wanted it to be honest. Probably could have done with a bit more light, because the picture I had in mind was sort of one where the foreground is illuminated by the actual sunlight, and the background is more grey, and this wasn't that. But it turned out quite cool, and there were many other opportunities down the road to come to take that picture. Cape Town to Van Wyksdorp is normally about a 4-hour drive, but at this stage, between the rain and stopping for photos, I'd already been on the road for 4 hours, and there were continually things that I found worth stopping for. Shortly before Barrydale, I spotted a waterfall out of the corner of my eye, and I know this road very well, so I know that there's no waterfall there usually. It had been raining so much and so hard that a waterfall had come into existence, and I figured it was worth making an image of. Some more rain and a hydroplane-weary drive later, I arrived in Barrydale. It's a cool little town and one of the centerpieces of the R62 tourist experience. It's also named for my ancestors on my mom's side, the Barrys. Don't know much about it besides that my grandma has made sure I know this much. Shout out to my gran. I let some air out of my tires at the petrol station, filled up and cruised on. The air gets let out so that you're ready for a dirt road because in general it's better to drive a dirt road with slightly less pumped up tires. Although my dad is probably the person I know that has done the most dirt road driving, and he reckons that's actually a bit of a waste of time. So, food for thought. Once you've left Barrydale is when the drive starts to get properly beautiful normally, with rolling hills and mountain vistas to the left and right from the Swartberg and Langeberg mountain ranges, respectively. In this case, it was mainly grey clouds and rain. And I stopped to try and make an image of a little farmhouse, which didn't work out because there was a break in the clouds that disappeared by the time I'd got set up. That was starting to become a theme already, so I figured I'd look for a grey scene instead of trying to rely on intermittent cloud breaks, and ended up finding a nice one shortly after the failed farmhouse attempt. Some Karoo vistas did start to peek out as it got later in the afternoon, and shortly before I reached Ronnie's sex shop, I got to experience the nicest rainbow I've ever seen. This is also the moment that I realized somehow my 50mm Mamiya RB67 lens is not wide enough to capture a rainbow. So there's an interesting fact for you. By this stage, I was starting to really enjoy the amount of stops I was making, so when I rolled up to Ronnie's sex shop, I stopped to take a photo of it for the client because Mandy, person I was making these pictures for, wanted some classic Karoo scenes, and Ronnie's sex shop is about as classic as it gets. Not actually a sex shop, it's a bit of a joke that's continued on for a number of years now, where someone originally had Ronnie's shop and someone came and painted sex next to it, and it's lived there ever since. It's part of the place now. Don't think Ronnie even owns it anymore. Don't hold me to that though, I'm not sure. I decided I'd cruise back a couple 100 meters to visit a succulent garden that Mandy had suggested I go to. This was my first brush on this trip with the dangers of South African solo traveling, as I was viciously attacked upon my arrival.
Hey, we don't do clothes on pants, that's not nice.
The place was very quaint though, in spite of the dangers, and I made a couple of images and bought some vinyls before leaving, since succulents weren't likely to survive 2 weeks on the road with me, and ended up making friends with my attackers somehow. After that little adventure, it was starting to get late in the day though, and I didn't really want to end up driving the dirt road to Van Beeksdorp in the dark and rain, so I decided to push straight through from there. This decision lasted all of 15 minutes though, since the light had started to break through properly for the first time on the drive, and I had to stop to make a landscape. And as soon as I stopped, the clouds closed up again, and the light was gone. Thankfully, it came back briefly, and I managed to beat the system, but I was growing very wary of seeing amazing scenes in the distance and arriving only to have them disappear as soon as I set up. This happened a few more times before reaching the road to Van Beeksdorp, so when the light started kicking off on that dirt road, I was ready. I've never seen a scene like this before now, where the clouds are so heavy and the ground so wet that the golden hour light ended up being almost brown. But I'm very happy to have managed to experience and photograph it, and the slice of rainbow in the scene is just the icing on the cake. The scene directly behind, where the light for this phenomenon was originating, was also sublime, so I turned around and photographed it, interrupted by a farm fence. I've probably driven this dirt road like 50 times by now, and it's never been as bad as it was on this day. The rain had obliterated it and left endless potholes filled with water. And as the light faded, it was slow going before finally making it to Van Beeksdorp. I assessed the car situation and ended up having a quick ride in the rain with Maya's dad before heading to bed. It had been a pretty intense day, but I was glad to be through it and looking forward to what I had planned for the next leg of the trip. The next day, things were looking up. The sun was out and the light was looking great, so I left as soon as I woke up. The contrast between the previous day and this morning was insane, and I was sure it meant that the rest of the first leg would be smooth sailing from then on. The destination for the day was Johnsonville, the place where I'd be shooting the main portion of the assignment that I was on. It's a 5-hour drive, in theory. Leaving from Vakestorp, I realized that this was probably the prettiest I'd ever seen it look. The rains had washed away the layer of dust that usually covers everything, and the soft winter morning light made things feel quite whimsical. I left the town excited to see what the road had to offer, and was almost immediately brought to a stop to make an image of a road sign with a glorious vista behind it. As I lined up the shot, I saw an old car cruise by and managed to time it so that it appeared in the image just before disappearing into the shadow of a hill, making it pop nicely from the surrounding environment. So, I've just finished the roll that's in the Mamiya 7 on that picture, and I'm making a conscious note that I'm going to get out, go to my film stash and reload the camera before I continue onwards, because my lizard brain says that I want to just keep going, but my photographer's brain says I better load it, because if there's something that needs to be flashed and needs to be done quick, then having to load the camera in that moment's not going to be particularly good. Photographer brain wins. I've run into a hiccup because the entirety of my plan for this day was revolving around going up the Swartberg Pass and showing you what things look like there. But unfortunately, because of the huge storm that I drove through yesterday, there is no pass. The road is closed. In fact, a lot of roads are closed. So today is probably mainly going to be about trying to get through the Karoo with the amount of roads that are closed. At this stage, I was so lost in enjoying the change in weather from the previous day and stopping for pictures that I realized I'd been on the road for an hour already, and that at this rate it was going to take me like 12 hours to complete a 5-hour drive. I decided I was fine with that though, and that the focus of the day with actual sunshine would be image making. The next town along the road was going to be Ladysmith. It's a quaint little place that I don't find particularly photographically invigorating normally. On this day though, as I started nearing the town, I saw a huge plume of smoke in the distance and decided to investigate. I figured I needed to pump my tires up anyway, since there was a lot of tar road driving to come, so I pulled into the petrol station in Ladysmith with the thought of tire inflation and fire location.
Goedemorgen. Ek wil my tires laat oppomp. Weet jy wat aan die brand is daar? Daar agter die berg brand het.
Kijk, dat is een klein beetje achter de kop.
Ja, oh. O, daar staan die ding. Weggesteek. Wat sit agter daai bulb wat aan die brand kan wees? Kan 'n mens daar uitkom?
Having received some vague directions from the petrol attendant to reach the road I thought the fire might be on, I headed off to find it, and was almost immediately on a dirt road again just after having inflated my tires. Luckily, I decided only to fill them up slightly so that they were in an in-between pressure between tar and dirt road, and that would end up being a very good situation, in this case and down the line that day. Before too long, I'd found the source of the smoke. It was a controlled burn, so not the most invigorating subject matter, and I couldn't get particularly close to it since there was no one to ask permission to enter the private land. But it ended up working out quite well because the light that was going on in the mountainous background adds a lot to the resulting frame, I think. Eager to get back on the road to Johnsonville, I started heading back down the dirt road to Ladysmith, munching away on a peanut butter breakfast bar, and almost immediately ended up popping a U-turn to go check out a scene I'd just driven past. There was an old Mercedes bus pulled over on the side of the road under some blue gum trees with two jovial fellas hanging out on the roof. The picture I ended up with isn't exactly the image I had in mind for that scene, but it was still a cool moment, and I'm glad I stopped for the picture. After that interaction, I got back on the road with an eye on Otsuen and seeing if there was anything going on there. Before I could get to Otsuen though, I ended up back on some marvelous passes.
How much these passes look like each other. Like there's one, the front trip pass feels very similar to this, and there's one that goes somewhere around PE over a mountain there that also feels identical, like the mountains on the side and the curviness of it. Kind of bizarre, with of an out of place feeling going on right now. I know why this feels so familiar. It's because I've been on this road at least 5 times in my life on my way to Aberdeen. Maybe I'll stop for a picture. Why this quite nice. Or maybe I won't. I don't know. We'll see. It is an insane landscape in that direction. And I'm not allowed to turn right to stop, so that's a bit of a problem. I've taken a bunch of pictures here before actually. Pictures that haven't been in videos, but the trip that I was on the last time I was here was the trip where I photographed Aberdeen and edited my first video. So that's the last time I was here. Pretty beautiful. Unfortunately, can't stop going this way. I actually think, if memory serves, there's a place I can pull up on the left over here, and I will most certainly be doing that. If there is. I think it's just like a little alcove thing. Anywhere where there's space for me to pull my car to the side right now, I'm gonna make use of, because the rocks don't always look like this. Here we go. Like the wetness of them has made things pretty wavy.
I'm gonna break your heart and take a picture of this thing, I think. It fits with the railing photographs I've been making lately. There's another spot there, damn it! I made a singular picture on that pass, mainly because I was obliterating my film budget for the job already, but also because I was quite focused on this drive, on doing my best to make images that didn't feel like tourist snaps. If you watched the Pentax 17 video I put out recently, you'll likely have noticed that I'm not enthralled with tourist snap images at the moment, and that's largely a result of the satisfaction I got out of pushing myself to look for unusual compositions on this trip. I also have a series of images of road guards like that going on, and I figured this image would fit nicely there. The next place I ended up was Kallitstorp, a small town shortly before Otsuen. I photographed a palm tree with a bougainvillea growing out of it many years before, and decided to go see if it was still around. I ended up finding the tree but not photographing it. The light wasn't right and the scene didn't appeal. I did, however, find a sick old Datsun. As had been the case for the majority of the stops so far, they're pretty popular tourist spots because of the R62. Otsuen is no different. They have a bunch of ostrich-related things going on, since ostrich feathers were what built the town back in the day. None of this was of particularly large interest to me though, since I mainly just wanted to go see how much of the Swartberg Pass I could manage to traverse, even if only to try stop at the Kango Caves. So I set off to see how far I could get.
Well, this is the road that's meant to be closed. The first road that's meant to be closed, going to the Kango Caves. So maybe we're in luck. Maybe the Swartberg Pass. Is it worth adding 40 minutes to the trip to drive to the Kango Caves? Okay, I'll report back. I'm gonna check how we're doing for time. Right, add a look at the map. We'll add 40 minutes to go to the Kango Caves, and I'm only about 3 hours and 20 minutes away from where I want to be. So 3 hours and 14 minutes once I leave there is very doable, I reckon. So I'm gonna go see what's up. Because I've always wanted to go see them, but I've never seen them, so maybe this time's the time.
The road is closed due to flood damage, but I had a conversation with that lovely policeman back there, and he said if I signed a form that said, well, not signed a form, if he wrote a note and I signed it that says I accept responsibility for anything that happens, I can go see the rocks. So I'm gonna go see if I can find the rock slide. The road was sketchy in terms of the amount of rock slides that had happened during the storm, but I reckon it was completely worth it in the end just to get to experience the sensation of being the only person driving along such a scenic and popular route. There was no chance I'd get to reach the actual Swartberg Pass itself, but the foothills themselves are beautiful in their own right, and it was a privilege to enjoy them solo in this manner. Before long, I came upon the source of the roadblock drama. One tends to wonder in situations like this whether there's actually a good reason for a road to be closed, and as it turned out, this was a pretty good reason. I had a bizarre interaction with a couple of people who were trying to come from the other direction, where they explained that since this route, the route to Prince Albert, and even the Meringspoort route were closed, they were essentially locked into their valley until one of the roads could be cleared. The guy I'd been talking to ended up wandering off to see if there was a way that he could get around the roadblock by traversing a farm nearby, while I went and made some pictures. Satisfied with the conclusion that I could in fact not make it up the road to the Swartberg Pass, I started driving back the way I came, to start on the road to De Rust. I came upon an absurdly beautiful scene on the roadside that I had to stop for though. A stream that would normally likely be a trickle had turned into a full-on river in the rain, and it was framed by this marvelous willow tree. I made a couple of images there and just stood for a while and listened to the silence and enjoying the fact that I'd never again likely in my life get the opportunity to be there alone with no cars passing by. Once I'd had my fill of solitude though, I decided it was time to actually get on the road to De Rust. On the way, I spotted an absurdly cool mountain lit up by a break in the clouds in the distance, and knew in my soul that by the time I got there, the clouds would have closed up and the light would be gone. I ended up getting a picture of it anyway. Not the exact one that I saw in the distance, but the light slightly broke through the clouds and gave some illumination for it, and this is probably my favorite picture from that day, just because the colors of it came together so well. Like, it's rare to have a picture where I scan it and I don't really have to do anything besides maybe adjust the contrast because I scan things so flat, but this one, everything was just pretty much perfect. I'd spent 15 minutes standing there waiting for the light though, so I was eager to get back on the road to De Rust. This road closure business is getting to be a bit much. The result of that roadblock, which was in fact a completely unexpected one compared to the previous one where I'd kind of known that I wasn't going to be able to do it, was that I'd have to drive an hour back in the direction of George to reach the N9 highway and then cruise another hour back towards where I already was to reach basically the same point, just a bit closer to the coast and to be on a road where I could actually progress. All in all, it was going to add 2 hours to the journey, but there was no way around it since the police officer had shown me what the road looked like, and it was thoroughly impassable. The main issue with the fact that I was likely going to reach Janssenville in 5 hours now was that I'd be driving unknown roads in the dark. This is not a great idea at the best of times, but given the amount of flood damage I'd been witnessing, I was worried about the lesser known dirt roads I'd be driving being washed out. and other dangers that have the potential to lurk on dark South African roadsides. I resolved to try put some proper distance between myself and Oudtshoorn now, given that my cavorting had turned a 1.5 hour drive into a 6 hour excursion already. The N9 was a pretty trucky road though, as it turned out. Not helped by the road closures, so I ended up spending a lot of time on that road sitting behind trucks, like this one that I photographed because it was blue and the blue sky in the background was cool. The only scene that ended up actually drawing me to a stop on this section of road was this one, with the long grass on the side of the road and cloud breaks on the mountain in the distance. I made a quick operation out of it though, since I'd just overtaken 3 trucks and wasn't keen to let them get past me again. At this stage in the day, pretty much every image that I'd stopped for that was reliant on what the light was doing in the background had changed by the time I'd gotten there, and I was getting super sick of it. As I came over the peak of a hill though, I saw some proper cloud break light beam action going on though, and decided I just had to try.
The light disappeared.
The light disappeared.
That picture actually turned out alright in the end. There was some light coming through the clouds despite my reaction, but it wasn't even close to how nice it had been before I managed to get close enough. It was starting to feel quite late in the day though, so I decided to try make it to Willowmore and reevaluate things from there. I got lost in thought, enjoying the landscapes and scenery for a while, and before I knew it, I was pulling up to the petrol station in Willowmore to reevaluate and enjoy some local delicacies.
Goedemiddag.
Maar diesel?
Ja.
Diesel terug. Hoe dan 2 meneer?
Kan je volgooien?
Ik maak voorbij dan.
Ik kan aan de glorie bij de is.
Ben je er 4 uur gekomen? Gisteren? Ja. Nee, ik was gisteren op pad hier van Kaapstad af. Het heeft gereend.
The town had been impacted quite heavily by the floods from the previous day, and there was a large amount of water and mud hanging around. I had a gander at the surroundings, and then ended up making a photograph of some kids putting air in their bicycle tires. The light had come out from behind the clouds briefly, and it made for some glorious, soft golden rays. This gas station pie tastes a bit like freezer. The appearance of this lovely light did make it quite apparent though that the sun was getting quite low in the sky, and I still had at least 2 hours of driving to do to get to Janssenville. The next town I was aiming for was Stateleville, and I honestly did not expect the drive there to be as interesting as it turned out.
Look at this. This is a very creative road. What if someone is coming the other way on this road? I mean, as dodgy as this road is, I can at least guarantee that I've never been on it. Oh, and look, it's turning into a real road now. So, that was fun while it lasted. Wow. Now I'm on a proper South African road trip adventure. Oh, man! I mean, to be honest, I haven't seen a single car coming this direction yet, which is useful in terms of not freaking out in this scenario, but also a bit worrying because why is no one else on this road? Okay, I just got the answer to the question of what happens if someone is coming from the front, because there was a minibus coming from the front, and the answer is you play chicken until the last minute, and then you both go one wheel on the other side of the road. I didn't play chicken, the guy driving in front of me did, because clearly he wasn't willing to just give way. I just gave way, because I guesstimated that would be the strategy. Anyway, hopefully this doesn't go on forever. The light on those mountains is incredible right now. And I'm willing to bet that by the time I get there, there won't be light anymore. Maybe it must have the 250 mode and see if I can make a weird road / landscape picture. might have got that picture just then. And look, this is the way that this road passing business goes. Well, not really like this. He's meant to actually have given away a bit. I'm just being polite and giving all the way. But that's how it works. Someone surrenders, someone just goes.
It started to feel like I was in an alternate dimension driving on that road after a while. The scarcity of other cars and the overgrown nature of the road was super isolating, but also incredibly freeing in a weird way. Like I was in some sort of uncharted territory. And the way that the clouds and sunlight started to play with each other as the sun set made it feel all the more surreal.
So weird, there's like a beam of light in the clouds over there that's a completely different color to the rest of everything. It's like a lot more cyan. I really want to try and make a picture of that. It's going to look insane. I mean, it's going to look like there's something wrong with the film, but that is what it is. Oh, I guess it's the sun shining through a cloud back there. Just crossed the road in front of me. I think there's a kudu, which are actually really hard to see normally. Wow. I promise, this isn't me being unsafe. I haven't seen another car on this road for like half an hour. I just want to take a blurry foreground picture of this sunset situation. So take a picture while driving, but as you can very clearly see, no one in front, no one behind. I'm driving very slow. I just wait for the angle. Who knows? Maybe that makes it in the video, maybe it doesn't. Okay, but I actually do need to step on it now because it's gonna get dark.
The light as I rolled into Stateleville was glorious. A delicious, soft pink situation that made everything look wonderful. I ended up making 3 images there. One of the entrance to the town, reflecting in a puddle, and then a group shot for some children who wandered past when I was making that picture and asked for a picture, and one of my car intruding on the sunset. I wondered briefly what it would have been like to be on the road I'd just come in on with the sunlight doing this, and decided that if I ever came back this way, I'd have to try be there at this time to see what it might look like. I need to explain briefly what happened with the drive for the final leg of this journey. I'd been told in advance that Google Maps will try to put you on the fastest route, but that it's a dirt road and not great for unsuited cars. The safer route to get to Janssenville is to go a roundabout way following tar roads. Being that I was on an adventure and in possession of a well-suited car for dirt roads, I decided I'd do the dirt road. The only real worry was that the flooding would have impacted the road, but I decided it was worth the risk and set out as twilight fell to go finish off the intense day. Before I'd made it very far down the road, I came upon a surreal scene. The landscape had been compressed in some sort of geological phenomenon, quite similar to the Kochmanskloof formation I'd driven through the previous day, but on a smaller scale and in a much more natural setting. The river that runs through it normally seemed to have clogged up with a wash of silt in the heavy rain, and I stood there for a while admiring the scene and the quietness of the setting before hearing a car engine approaching in the distance and deciding it was time to move on. Now, being that I shot it handheld at a fourth of a second, it is quite blurry, but that was intentional. I mean, I had a tripod there ready to go and decided in the moment that the picture I wanted to make was going to be a slightly blurry one because I figured that it'd add to the scene. Looking back on it, I'll probably make one with the tripod again next time I go there, just because the sharp fiend in me would have liked to have a sharp picture of that scene. A brief note on dirt roads. Not all dirt roads are of the same caliber. The largest determining factor in a dirt road's functionality is the level of maintenance it receives. The worst possible time to drive a dirt road anywhere is directly after heavy rain and wind, because the loose layer of soil that gets deposited relatively smoothly all gets washed and blown away. And what you're left with is a rough lunar surface that obliterates everything it touches. There are ways to avoid the worst of a certain level of bad road, the main one being to drive fast enough to just float over the unevenness. The catch with this is that your vehicle's grip is also greatly diminished, so if you take a corner too fast or veer too close to the edge of the road where the soil is looser, bad things can happen. This road was probably the worst dirt road I've ever been on. It was clearly not properly maintained, and what little smoothness it might have had before the flooding had been thoroughly rinsed away. The worst of it though really was the fact that what had before been big potholes were now essentially huge swimming pools that covered the entire road. Balancing between these obstacles and proper technique to avoid damaging the car or myself was essentially impossible, and what followed as pitch darkness fell around me was the most intense hour of obstacle traversal I've ever done. If the swimming pool sized potholes weren't enough, there was also the fact that this road was built over what would normally be tiny streams, and it dips into them to allow one to drive through what would likely be a few centimeters of water normally at worst. On this day, as a result of the flooding, every little stream was pretty much a proper river to traverse. I didn't end up filming much in the way of video of this portion because I was pretty much just struggling not to wipe out.
It never ends. Although it's about to. This is the road to the farm where I'm gonna go make some photos for them. So I'll report back once I get to the spot. It has been a very hardcore drive, I will say that.
I just got here. It's late. These are the digs. Very interesting vibes. Apparently it's haunted. I will report back in the morning. Sorry if I seem tired. I've been on the road for 12 hours. Feels a lot less haunted in the morning. You might be asking yourself, where on earth is this man? And the answer to that question, directly, is that I'm on a farm outside of Johnsonville, about 15 kilometers along a dirt road, the last dirt road I came down last night. And I'm here on assignment because a client has asked me to come photograph this house before it gets renovated to be turned into a place for people to stay. It is a very interesting old house. I think it's client's grandparents, and hopefully I'm going to make some interesting photographs. There is no shortage of wonderful things. The trick is going to be picking the right wonderful things and making sure I don't waste frames, because there's nowhere to buy film around here really. Being able to document this space was an incredibly unique experience. A variety of factors made it so special, but the overarching sensation in the moment was the fact that one could feel what it once was and imagine what it was going to become. This place had been palatial in its heyday. Time and solitude had left a definite mark on its current state, but the fact that it had remained essentially completely unchanged since the 60s meant there were some incredibly unique scenes to see. I started out by heading over to the farm section and photographing the sheep shearing that was taking place. The shearing room was quiet, save for the baaing of the sheep and the sound the shears made cutting through their thick wool. It was in this quiet room, though, that I made a mortal enemy. Jason. Jason was the oldest in a troop of border collies that roamed the farm, and he was quite slow in his movement and very blind. I flashed Jason for a photograph, and he decided to take that personally. All he did in the moment was growl a bit, but he'd have his revenge before long. I then moved on to the pool house. Side note, Mandy told me that recently when she was back up there and they were clearing out the space, since now that I photographed it, the renovations can begin in proper, that they'd found a bunch of snakes. So I was in fact not alone in making these pictures. Just had silent companions slithering around in the background. I moved around the pool house and made images of a few of the things that had ended up there over the last 60 years. In hindsight, it was a pretty great place to live if one were a snake, so I'm probably quite lucky I didn't run into any of the scaly residents that were hanging out there at the time. The next day and a half was spent photographing a large variety of interesting and memorable spaces. The goal was to represent things as true to their origins as they could be given the effects of time on some of the areas. The spaces themselves were about as 60s as it's possible for things to be, and a lot of what was going on stylistically felt incredibly similar to places I'd visited growing up, where all the family members had carried over bits of their aesthetic into their more modern homes. This place was like the unfiltered original of this style though, and I found it fascinating to photograph and strangely nostalgic at times, given that I'd never been there, but many of the elements could well have been part of my grandma's house. The strategy we adopted for image making itself was to be as precise as possible. I only had 5 rolls to work with, and there were about 40 images to make that were super important. So we probably spent on average 45 minutes per scene setting it up and making things look nice stylistically. And then hoping the strobe would go off, because the thing with my Mamiya Abi 6.7 is that it's always a tiny bit up to luck in the end. The collection of images I made here are probably the strongest set of pictures I've ever made in one space as a result. The contact sheets are sublime too, since the specificity of composition and consistent lighting with the flash means that all the exposures are pretty much the same and print super nicely. I'll actually be selling a few of these contact sheets that I printed in the darkroom, so you can check them out in the description of this video. We worked late into the night on the first day and were up early the next day to get the final scene sorted out. My plan was to leave as soon as we were done making the images. I wasn't in a rush, but also wanted to get to my next destination as soon as I could to start work there, since that was the end goal of the trip, really. I've made a little breakdown video for the flash photos you see here. It's up on my Buy Me a Coffee for members, so if you want a rundown of how I made some of the images happen, have a gander over there. The reason I got to go on this trip at all is because of the support this channel receives from Buy Me a Coffee membership and contributions from people such as yourself, so feel free to check it out if you're enjoying things so far. There will be some outtakes from this section of images as well that aren't necessarily suited to YouTube up on my Buy Me a Coffee, so really worth having a look. Anywho, once all the scenes had been photographed, I packed up, said my goodbyes. Goodbye, bed. Goodbye, dresser. Goodbye, rocking chair and fan. Got bit by Jason because he was hanging around as I was packing my car, and when I walked past him for the last time to get on the road, he gave me a good solid nip, not hard enough to draw blood, but you know, a bite, and hit the road. The sun was peeking through the clouds intermittently, and I had things to see.
Lover, where can you be?
I mentioned at the start of this video that one can find oneself in dangerous situations traveling solo on the open road in South Africa if you aren't savvy about it. And on this day, I ended up in one of those situations. Before any of it went down though, I set out with an eye on Uitenhage, where my grandma had lived. Side note, Uitenhage, Kariga, Uitnag are all ways that this place can be referred to. Kariga is, I think, the current name for the town. Uitnag is the way one says it if you're Afrikaans, and Uitenhage is the English pronunciation, I think. My gran had lived there for the last portion of her life before she passed away, and I wanted to go see if the house she'd stayed in was still around so I could photograph it. It's wild how quickly the natural environment can change in South Africa, and over the course of about 150 kilometers, I got to see just how quickly it can happen, driving from somewhere inland to somewhere more coastal. I didn't do much in the way of stopping on this drive since the curse of the clouds continued, but at least some of the scenes get to exist in video form. When I reached Uitnag, I called my dad to ask if he could remember what street his mom had lived on when she lived there. Lucky for me, he did remember, although he wasn't certain what the house number was, so it was up to me to drive along the road and decide if I could determine which house was hers. I found one that kind of looked like it looked in my memory, but as it turned out, I met the owner or someone that lived there when I was setting up to photograph it, and he had been there for quite some time and said that this was definitely not my grand's house. He said 1-2 houses up might have been the one, but it had been renovated and didn't look anything like what I remembered my grand's house looking like, so I photographed this house since it gets to exist as sort of a stand-in, really. The owner is actually hiding behind the little wall in the foreground there in this picture. After making that image, I decided to hit the road to try get to Boknes, my final destination, and it was on this section of the drive that I ended up in the situation. One might say, based on the fact that nothing actually ended up happening in this situation, that I'm overreacting a bit, but 2 weeks after I'd been driving on this bit of road, there was an attempted hijacking there, quite a widely publicized one, actually. Here are some stills of the attempted hijacking in question. Thankfully, I made it through without incident, probably largely because I was going as fast as I safely could do, but the only reason really that I didn't end up in the exact situation as these screenshots is dumb luck and the fact that I drive an old car. So something to keep in mind whilst I show you all these breathtaking scenes from South Africa. At this stage, I was about an hour and a half away from my final destination of Boknes, the place where I'd be shooting what I hoped would turn into a photo project. The place my dad grew up and where my uncle had been a dairy farmer for the majority of his life. Somewhere I'd visited frequently when I was younger and less frequently over the years. My hope in visiting this place was to try and develop an understanding of what it was that I actually had as a heritage. As I mentioned early in this video, having grown up in such varied places, I don't really have a thorough understanding of what it actually means to be me. The theory behind this journey and the project I hope to make was that I'd learn something about myself, hopefully by experiencing what life could have been like if my dad had never left this place. On a technical level, I wouldn't exist. He wouldn't have met my mom, but what if there was a me that did exist in some alternate sphere and the life I got to live was here? That was the overarching question I wanted to answer, alongside other things like the nature of being Afrikaans, really, because as much as I am Afrikaans and speak Afrikaans fluently, it's not really a culture I've spent a particularly large amount of time experiencing, so I wanted to go find out what it was all about. In order to do this, I'd be meeting up with connections I'd made on a prior trip to this area, since, as I say, this is something I've been wanting to do for years, as well as revisiting areas that I see as important based on my memory of the place when we'd visit growing up. This, in combination with stories from people, would hopefully give me a picture of a life I'd never had. Essentially, a portrait of a place with a focus on what was and what could have been, in an attempt to understand something about myself and where I live. Pretty much, as soon as you turn off the N2 to head towards Alexandria, the landscape starts to shift. For me, driving through this tunnel bit has always signified entry to the place my dad is from. Being in this area puts me in a completely different mindset, and I think of everything through the lens of what it would have been like for my dad growing up there. The place at large is all about farming, but the rolling hills and lush green farms always feel like something out of a storybook to me. I was treated to some marvelous light for the first little bit of the drive and made the most of it by stopping a couple of times to make some landscapes of these hills that I'd seen so many times but never photographed. One of my favorite elements in the landscape as a whole around here are the trees that remain in large maintained fields. They're left there as windbreaks and shade for livestock in most fields. However, in unmaintained fields, the natural shrubbery quickly makes a comeback, and if you catch a field in the right state of decay, then it too might have a tree or two sitting stubbornly in a plain field. The marvelous sun quickly turned into drizzle and then rain as I got near Boknes. As I reached Alexandria, I stopped at the graveyard to say hi to my gran and do a bit of maintenance, and by the time I hit the road again, the sun was setting on the other side of this rainstorm. Driving into Boknes ended up meaning driving further into the rainstorm, and as the stormy twilight fell, I rolled up to the beach.
Well, this sucks.
This general area of the world is going to be where the majority of the rest of this video takes place, so allow me to give you a bit of a spatial context and some reference for places I wanted to photograph as part of this project. There's Boknes, a small holiday town on the beach. Alexandria, the town we drove through where my dad went to school and uncle lived. The farm, a reference point to visit and view scenes of what I'd imagine life would have been like as a dairy farmer. Also where my friend Herky farms. Kenton-on-Sea, the beach holiday town a little way away where we'd visit growing up. And Boschuk, the valley my dad grew up in. All of these places are part of the Ndlambe local municipality in the Sarabatman district municipality of the Eastern Cape. These places and the scenes around them would be the canvas for all the images I was gearing up to make for this project. The morning after arriving, I was up at 5 a.m. to go say hi to my friends, the dairy farmers. The first milking for the day is at 5:30 a.m., so the best way to make sure to run into them is to be where you know they'll be. I'd reached out to the farmer I'd met the last time I was that side of the world, and he'd agreed to let me tag along with him for the sake of a project. But unfortunately, he wasn't there that morning. I did get to say hi to the farm's foreman and the senior farmer who went to school with my dad, but left a little bit deflated because I didn't know what to do with myself for the rest of the day. I ended up sweeping. It gave me time to think and wait for my friend Herky to get back to me since I wanted to start out photographing farm scenes, and Herky is a farmer. I also find sometimes when I'm not sure what I want to do on a photographic front, doing something productive of any variety can get things flowing. Once I'd swept, I figured I'd go for a little bit of a scout walk while the light wasn't nice and see if there was anything I could think of to photograph later when the light got nice. The strategy for now is looking like take it easy, scope out the light, understand the way that things render out here, and go check up on spots that I know I want to photograph. And as soon as all of that is lined up, we're going to be off to the races. I don't know, I feel a bit deflated at the moment. Deflated and very alone. I am bringing this bad boy with on my location scout walks because you never know when you're going to see something that's clearly as good as it's going to get. think one of my earliest holiday memories is right here. Being freaked out by those things. It's sunset now, and the light's good in that direction, but it's not good here. But my Sunseek app says that the sun comes up there in the morning, which will be perfect for here. What happens with this dam is that it fills up when there's sand in the way over here, and then gets super full. And if you break it, it causes a huge rush of water. And when my dad was a kid on holiday once, him and his cousin, I think, or a friend, dug a trench for like 3 days between the dam and the sea to break it, and then got in huge amounts of trouble because obviously it's not ideal to break a dam on a beach or something along those lines. The water refracting. See, it's just plain grey and then you kick it and the water causes refractions. Let me try and make a photo of that. My Mamiya 7 kind of let me down some of the time on this trip. It's been doing this thing for a long while now where it sort of underexposes a bit. I thought I'd counter it by overexposing literally every picture I took by a stop, but it still didn't work in some of the frames. So I'm not sure if it's got to do with the battery or the way its meter is functioning, but going forward I'm probably going to overexpose 2 stops just to avoid anything being on the underside. It was consistently incredibly cold at night on this trip. The combination of it being midwinter and by the sea and staying in what was essentially meant to be a summer beach house meant that there wasn't really any sunlight that got into the house throughout the course of the day, so it stayed cold and was just ultra cold at night. I really struggled with that. The next morning though, I hit the road at 5 AM again and managed to meet up with a farmer, Harki. I'd met Harki once before this trip. His dad and my dad went to school together, and him and I got along spectacularly. Prior to this outing, we were pretty much just acquaintances, but after spending 2 weeks with him, I'd consider us pretty good friends. I probably would have lost my mind out there if I didn't get to tag along with him and speak to another person consistently. My first morning with Harki was a beautiful one. The sunrise came up on a perfect day, and although it was freezing, I got some nice warm-up pictures and started learning all sorts of things about dairy farming.
Hierdie is nou al oor 'n maand se groei, maar die koekoe overshadow die raai. So nou laat ek die beeste inkom, dan tap hulle nou net amper so half soos 'n free gift in a way. Tap hulle nou soos hulle hierdie afvreet, gee hulle meer son vir die raaigras om te groei. Check jy?
Ja.
Maar as jy hom nou gaan pool test en jy trek hom soos 'n bees, dan trek jy nie sy root system uit nie. So sit hy nou en dan kan hy nou begin beter groei. Soos wat hulle hom so vreet. Nou so obviously meer son vir die raaigras om te groei.
Okay. Gee hulle om, wat is die tipe gras hier? Hulle meer van die raai of meer van die koekoe?
Hulle sal soos uitsif. Hulle sal soos die soetste, beste uitsif.
I also learned a lot of interesting things about Harki. Like I said early in the video, my perspective of South African culture and my heritage specifically is largely based on an outsider's perspective. It's not something I've been particularly involved in my entire life due to circumstance, and before this trip, my understanding of this side of South African society was likely largely the same as anyone who's heard about South African farmers and the general negativity associated with it. Almost immediately, getting to know Harki and folks around the farm though, it became apparent to me that this outside perspective, as is often the case with generalizations, was not particularly accurate. You see, Harki is a dairy farmer, a very dedicated and knowledgeable South African dairy farmer, but his great passion in life is surfing. Pretty much the first thing he showed me as he started out giving me what was Essentially, a tour of his life was the room where he shaped his surfboards. Now, I'm not sure what the mental picture most people have of South African farmers is, but I'd hazard a guess that dreadlock-wearing surfboard makers isn't particularly high on the list. I'll talk more about this concept as the images start to come together, but just know for context that I learnt a great many things that gave me a much more interesting understanding of this culture than I expected. The remainder of my time with Harki that morning was spent scouting the farm and making a couple of images. This one in particular is quite funny if you know the backstory. There are these single-strand electric wires that get used on farms to protect livestock from things like jackals, I suppose, and also make sure they don't roam where they're not meant to. And in order to get into different paddocks, one needs to drop these wires so you can drive over them. Harki asked me to go unclip this particular wire because I was wearing gumboots, so the deep mud and other car-related things wouldn't really matter. Gumboots can get dirty. So I headed over and I know what this is. I'm not silly. I knew it was an electric fence, but it was attached quite tautly to the pole. So I tried to give myself slack as I pulled on it to try to lift it up, and in doing so, grabbed the electric wire and was promptly electrocuted. This was kind of hilarious for Harki, and everyone on the farm knew before long that I'd gotten a proper jolt. And you'll note going forward that I'm a lot more tentative around the electric fences on this farm. Once I'd been given the tour and seen the inside of some tractor part stores, I went on my own way. Found a laundry in Kenton and explored a local antique store on the way home. The day ended with another scout walk as rain clouds rolled in. If you've watched some of my other videos, you'll likely know that I'm no stranger to early mornings. Be they for work, where I have to be on set before like 5 a.m, or for videos where I want to go catch the dawn light. So thankfully, the 5 a.m. starts to get to the farm weren't particularly hard for me, outside of the cold. My car hates the cold, and I hate the cold. Every morning that I got up to start the car at like 5 would be a bit of a struggle to see if it was going to decide to keep rolling that day. It always did though. Shout out to my car. I was feeling better about my progress as things got going that morning too. I had some direction now in terms of being able to freely access the farm, and the stories I'd been hearing about childhood from the older farmer had got the gears turning in terms of places I wanted to photograph. I brought the 4x5 with me as well to try get going with that business. And then, upon Harki's suggestion, decided to see if my old car can make it up the hill that overlooked the farm. Thank goodness I have this car, because these speed bump things are really quite steep, and I keep being scared that I'm going to bottom out on them and get stuck hanging over the edge of a hill, basically. These wires are electrified. Ask me how I know. Large format photography. The medium of a true artisan. I've had 20 sheets of Kodak Portra 400 in my freezer for like 4 years now. I've been saving it for just this adventure. Hopefully I still remember how to use a large format camera. I've never shot the color 4x5 either. Only black and white. But the procedure is the same, the results are just different. And I've already taken my first one this morning in the milk stall. What would the English word for that be? Milk stall, I suppose? I don't know. All of my farm terminology is in Afrikaans because that's what I've been taught it in. But hopefully it's a banger. It has the potential to be really glorious. I might have gotten a bit too techie with it. I try to do some swing things and tilt things, and you never know how that works. My mate Chris is lending me his lovely little Toyo. And hopefully it works too. I know that the sheet film holders are of indeterminate quality, but I'm willing to roll the dice on that one. I'm just gonna have to hope that there aren't any light leaks. In theory, a large format camera is a simple thing. You give yourself a preview by opening up the aperture. When you've got your picture ready, you cock the shutter, make sure your composition is right, obviously, before all of this, and then you take the picture. But it being so simple means there's a lot of things that can go wrong along the way, simply. So hopefully I managed to nail everything and make a very nice photograph here. We're gonna head out into this field over here. There's a tree a ways down there that I reckon would be rad in the foreground. Just need to traverse some electric fence to get there. And I'm pretty sure it is electrified because I got zapped by it yesterday. Elegant. It's winter, so at least there shouldn't be much in the way of snakes to worry about. Just electric fences and deep holes hidden by grass. No electrocution for me. Quite a leg workout too. That fence probably isn't on, but I'm not going to take the risk. They zap pretty hard. One thing you don't want to do in life, other than zap your nuts, for most people, is break a farmer's fence. Now for the finicky business of composing a frame. I really hope that I left my car keys in the ignition because they aren't in my pockets, and if I lost them in here somewhere, they're gone. So how does the tilt business work on this thing? That's maxed out. Okay, this bush and foreground thing wasn't really working out the way I wanted it to, so I might just do a clean landscape. Maybe with the tree, because the tree still kind of has something going. This is feeling better, kind of looking better. Yep, that'll do. Close you up. Activate you. Put this thing in the right way around. Good. Don't worry, I will take the dark slide out. I'm just doing a check. Check is good. Oh, should probably put the settings in. That'd be helpful. Give it a bonus stop of light. Why not? Okay. Now for the moment of truth. Wow, that was a procedure. Okay, there's my picture done. Now I get to disassemble the whole thing. Let me bring its case over here. I ended up wandering somewhat further than anticipated, so I think I'm going to try to disassemble it and do this in one go, because this is quite a hill to go back up twice. Review. Bring that in, slowly, gently, carefully. In, up, down. I mean, one could probably get quite quick at that. Not that it's ever gonna be a quick procedure. Close the box. Try and avoid taking the whole field with you. I mean, it is a field camera after all. Cool. Now we just need to worry about 2 tripods. Large format photography, they said. Unparalleled quality, they said. They didn't mention that everything weighs like 600 kilograms. How do these YouTuber cats who only shoot large format electrify defense? They must be very fit and buff. Sod this. I'm not walking all this stuff up there. I'll bring the car here. Hopefully the keys are still in the car. Come on, my friends. Up we go. I love this car. This car was the best decision I ever made in my life. Look how tall this one is. I think it's time for old Susie to get her moment in the spotlight, because the hill that she just climbed out was insane, and have made her do similar things a number of times now. So it's only fair that she gets a picture. And what a place to do it. Yowza. The amount of dirt roads this car's already survived, and the amount that is still to come. What a legendary car. I reckon now's a pretty good time to go through the Buy Me a Coffee member list, because that's who made this journey possible. You may have noticed that up to this point in the journey, and hopefully for the remainder of this video, there aren't any YouTube adverts on it. That's because, just personally, I don't really enjoy not having control over things that show in front of these videos that I put out, because a toothpaste advert in front of a great adventure in my life doesn't really make sense to me. So the way in which this channel gets support is through Buy Me a Coffee and print sales and things like that. But worth mentioning that if you're enjoying things so far, it'd be greatly appreciated and contribute to the next adventure if you'd consider becoming a Buy Me a Coffee member, or just supporting the channel in whatever way I make possible in the description, I suppose. Anyway, I reckon I'll make a Mamiya picture of this landscape, just in case, because it's not really the right light, but maybe I don't make it up here again, in which case I'll have this. Where is my beanie? Bockness. You can see the lagoon I've been wandering around down there in the distance. Hopefully the focus is right here. I feel like I've taken a lot of photos of roads on this road trip. Oh, where's that damn beanie? Ah, underneath the large format camera. I reckon now that I've scoped this out, I know what to expect if I come back up. I reckon we'll cruise down the hill and go do breakfast potentially, and wait for better light. Yo, we are slipping here. I felt very much in the groove of things after the hill excursion. I made some more images around the farm in the afternoon, including this large format one, which is probably one of my favorites from the farm, of a farmhand. And I spent the rest of that afternoon meandering around, scouting places, and chatting to the foreman. The next day started at first light instead of 5 a.m., which honestly felt a bit like sleeping in at this stage. I went and made the image I planned on a couple of days earlier of the dawn light on the weird wormy line staircase situation. Told you we'd get dawn light on this stuff. Just need to wait for the right light sometime. and then took a wander around Borknes to see what other seaside village vibes I could find. Once the light had got a bit too high to be properly dawn, I decided to move on and go for an excursion to Kenton-on-Sea, since it was an important part of what I wanted to photograph, and I hadn't made the trek out there yet. One of the weirdest things in being out there alone was the amount of memories that came back to me. I'd been back in the area a fair few times. You'll likely even recognize Kenton from my cancer diagnosis video, but always with family and experiencing it in a totally different way. At this stage, I'd been there a number of days on my own already, and the time spent learning about the past and the way people grew up, combined with the solitude I felt on a lot of these excursions, seemed to bring new, old memories to light. Wandering around the dunes, which have shifted completely from memory. In fact, this dune covers the bathrooms for the beach, and seeing places I'd seen before felt different. The act of being out there solely for the purpose of remembering and trying to capture memories gave me a heightened sense of what I was experiencing. And I don't think I'll ever experience that rocky beach the same way I did on this day. I spent a lot of time thinking about what the place meant to me and how many other people had experienced it joyously growing up and what it meant to them, and how it feels different to be an adult in a place like this versus experiencing it as a child. I had a bit of a moment when it came time to exit that beach. I saw the rock formations one had to traverse to get out and wondered if perhaps the reason my dad became a geologist was because he spent so much time around interesting rocks growing up. He wanted to be a vet when he left home and went to Bloemfontein to do so. When he got to university there, though, he couldn't find his first class on the first day or something like that and decided to go to Stellenbosch instead, where he ended up studying geology.
This used to be a path. A proper path. Like a big path. I don't want to set the whole tripod up. So I'm going to try Mamiya 7. I've taken a lot of pictures with this Mamiya 7 on this trip at very low shutter speeds, so hopefully they're not all catastrophically blurry. Final frame.
Having been thoroughly nostalgized and a bit shocked at the state of that path, I headed back to Borknes. I stopped on the way to take a picture of the Busmans River, and then once I got back to the village, started setting up to make a large format image of the house we'd stayed the first time I came to Borknes, when I was like 4. The portion on the right is the house itself, and separate building on the left is the bathroom. I was not a fan of making that traversal between the house and the bathroom at night in the cold when I was 4. I took a few options of this image too, like I did for most of the 4x5 shots. I like redundancy when it comes to important stuff, so I made a Mamiya 7, RB67 and 4x5 image of this scene. I'm exposing for the shadows as well here, so hopefully all works out. I think now's the moment. So take this out, let them settle. I decided to keep wandering after that image and made my way to the beach once more. It was here that I ended up having one of the more marvelous, spontaneous interactions of this trip. As I was setting up to make this landscape, I was approached by a middle-aged man who was curious about my tripod and camera situation. As it turned out, he was there with his son and his son's friend for the yearly Alexandria versus PE fishing competition. I'd actually seen this go down a year or so previously when I watched a very well-equipped group of fishermen head to the beach. They were there for that maneuver again this year, and I'd run into them by chance. I made some images of the son and his friend looking for prawns to use for bait, and of the misty lagoon they were wading in. And as I was headed out, the older man stopped me and asked if I'd like to join them for dinner at the fishing club. The whole rest of the angling team was going to be there, and it was going to be a party. Now, being that up to this point, as you may have noticed, the solitude was getting to me somewhat, I immediately said yes. I was also very curious to see what the space looked like since he described it as being a bit of an adventure to get there. And later that evening, I packed my flash and my cameras and headed to the fishing club.
Let's do what like the guys do when they get a fish. Say your trick quickly, what's that?
That's the only bit of video I have from that evening, but I got some marvelous pictures. I ended up making portraits of anyone who was keen, had a delightful potjiekos dinner. Potjiekos is basically a stew cooked in a cauldron over an open fire, and photographed some elements of the space. This taxidermy pufferfish is my favorite image from the evening, I think. The collection of soft browns in the scene made it render so nicely with the flash. There will be prints of that one on my website for sure. Other than the interior, I took a detailed image of the back of a bucky packed for fishing the next day, some folks hanging out by their tent, and said no to the multitude of offers for a brandy and coke that I was subjected to that evening. Brandy and coke is sort of the classic South African drink, really. Drink a brandy and coke when you go to rugby. But I don't drink anymore, so couldn't partake. They invited me to come see how their fishing was going the next day, since they'd be in the midst of their competition, and I said I'd try, but that the day was actually slated for going on a Veidingsmeet operation with Härki. Veidingsmeet basically means pasture measuring, and that's what the plan was for the next day. When I woke up the next day, I decided I'd take a moment to go see how the fishing was going, since they'd seemed so keen on me knowing what was going on. They hadn't had much luck, but I said hi and wished them the best before heading to the farm. The first thing that Härki asked me when I arrived was whether I was sure I wanted to bring my camera bag, because there'd be a lot of walking. I said not to worry, that I was very used to carrying it, and he shrugged and said, if I insisted. Oh boy. I'd missed the part of the whole pasture measuring concept where one realizes that in order to measure pastures, you have to actually walk through them, and there's a decent amount of pastures that are of a decent size on a farm. So the next few hours were spent making images and lamenting the fact that I hadn't listened to Härki and left the camera bag behind. Fucking muggies. I tried to make a techie flash picture once we got back to the milk stall and I'd recovered from the walk, but the flash head refused to go off inside the office where I had it set up from where I was standing. I think it might have been a combination of the wall and glass and the distance, but I ended up with a blurry handheld long exposure instead. Once Härki had input the data he needed to put in the computer from the measuring and headed off to lunch, I decided to go see what was going on around Borkness again. I think the mindset that I was in looking for images that afternoon was mainly finding things that felt as weird as these small towns can be. Every time I go anywhere I have to cart all of this up those stairs or down those stairs and back up again. And I'm getting pretty bored of it, especially because this isn't all of the stuff I bring, this is just all I'm bringing now. I found a couple of interesting situations and then headed back to the farm. At this stage, I think folks had become used to having me around, so I didn't feel quite so much like I was intruding when I was there. The farm's foreman, Henk, who's in charge of the cow's health and upkeep, gave me a bit of an in-depth tour of how things work, and I made some images of things along the way. A decent amount of the images I made on this trip in general don't have video to go with them, so I'm leaving them out, but there are also a decent amount of images that I made that'll work best in book format, so keep an eye out for that, I suppose. Once I'd learned some more things about the animal husbandry and the like, I decided I'd do the Golden Mile as the sun set. The Golden Mile is basically a section of road between Alexandria and Borkness that connects them, but is purely made of dirt and runs along the coast past a bunch of farms. You can get to Alexandria either by the tar road or this dirt road. It's just that the dirt road takes a lot longer and is a lot bumpier. The reason it's called the Golden Mile is because it's absolutely sublime for sunsets. It's actually popped up before in a video, I think probably the Cancer one, but this time I was doing it in my car and at my pace, so I was hoping to see some marvelous things. I can honestly say that I've never been as inspired to make cow images as I ended up being on this trip. I mean, largely because it's a large part of the whole heritage thing that I'm interested in, but also because I'd learned so much about them that I felt more connected to them in a weird way. Anyway, after that sunset cow picture, I ended up cruising along and running into a scene that was too good to pass up. I tried to be very mindful in making photographs of the power an image has and how important a picture can be to someone. My main goal is never to force someone into being in a picture if they don't want to, and as part of that mindset, I'm a lot more comfortable making images of someone that has authority of some kind over me than vice versa, and photographing someone younger than myself tends to feel like there's an age-related authority thing going on, so I'm wary of it. In this case though, as I was cruising down this magical road at golden hour, I drove past a group of friends playing with wire cars. This scene was so surreal since I remembered my brother and I having very similar wire cars growing up, and I asked for an image. The one boy was also wearing wire glasses that he'd made for himself, so I asked for his portrait. I think outside of the immediate appeal of the scene, a large part of what interested me in what was going on that afternoon is that the magic of just walking along this incredible road at golden hour, playing with friends, is part of the element of childhood imagination that I was trying to come to terms with whilst being out there, and I'm really proud of these images.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Shop. No, that's what happens when you're rushing. What a waste of a picture. It's the first time I've done that on this trip with the large format vibe, and it's because I'm rushing for the light. Okay, we're good there, we're good there. Please don't intrude on my frame. Actually, you can intrude on my frame, you're kind of after the frame. What a waste of a large format picture. So what I did there was, you open this to preview the picture, and then you close it before you take the picture, and it's a very important step in making the picture, because obviously if you leave it open and then just take the dark side out, you're just exposing the film, which is what I did. And I mean, there's a chance that something comes out, because it'll only be heavily overexposed, and it is Portra 400, so you never know, but I mean, in essence, a gigantic waste of a frame, so boo me. See, now this time, I don't need to rush because the less light the better. So I'm not gonna burn a whole freaking large format frame, in theory. How sick is that tree? Kinda wanna do this vertically, if I can remember how that works. cannot see anything. There we go. I still can't see anything on the side from the camera. 4 seconds at f11, so we'll do 8 seconds. I just want to double check that I'm in focus, but I'm kind of freaking out about leopards, because there's leopards here, and they like to attack one while one's back is turned, so... What I really want to have happen here is that I illuminate this, and it's red, and I'm not going to do that with a flash. I'm going to do it with my torch, because it's going to be a 8-ish second exposure, so hopefully I manage to make that happen. Let's just do that. Torch test here real quick, that's fine. Not that red, okay. Orange it will be. I'm going to hold this against my stomach so that I can control it. Make sure the shutter is actuated. Let me just turn you around with this actually, so that at least there's video evidence of whatever happens. The lens is closed. Torch. Actuate. Shutter. Okay, I messed that up because it's bulb, not time, so let me just do that. It's mellow though, we can do the same exposure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9. And I guess we'll see. I'm going to do a backup of that on the RB. Okay. There's something big moving and grunting in the bushes in that direction, so hopefully the large format picture works. And we're going to leave it at that, and leave whatever is moving and grunting in the bushes in that direction to its own devices. Because I'm not trying to get munched today. Any other day, really.
In all honesty, it was probably just a warthog or something in the bushes back there, but I wasn't about to roll the dice on the leopard factor. I hightailed it out of there and drove the hour back to Borkness in the dark, where I collapsed upon my return home. It had been a very hardcore day. I'd been in the area a bit over a week at this stage probably, and still hadn't visited the valley my dad grew up in. The idea of this place was, after all, the main reason I'd been interested in coming all this way, so I decided, having experienced the ambiance of the surrounding farms at Golden Hour, that I'd head that way. Now, for context, since this place has greatly changed from what it once was, Boshuk used to be a community. There were many smaller farms along the valley where individual families farmed small scale and lived among each other. Being that Alexandria is already quite off the beaten track, this little valley that no one really had reason to come to besides living there kind of functioned as its own space. My understanding of the way this manifested itself is that, based on what I've been told by people that lived there at the time, there wasn't much in the way of segregation there once apartheid became a thing. Whatever color you were, if you had a farm there and had been farming there, you were a farmer and were treated as such by the community. I haven't spoken to anyone directly that can verify this, but I'd like to think that there's no reason for anyone to lie about it. Anyway, that's the way things were back then. Now, it's largely turned into a valley where smaller farms have been bought up by bigger farms, and the bigger farms in turn got sold on and have become somewhat run down. There are smaller dairy farm and beef farms operating there now, but for the most part, the farms are returning to nature as the agricultural aspect peters down in the valley. This is the house my grandma lived in. My family lived on multiple farms throughout the valley over the years, but this is the one my dad remembers as being his mom's house. His uncle was a landscaper at Kirstenbosch Botanical Gardens and I believe had a hand in setting up a marvelous tiered garden here that doesn't exist anymore. It won second place in the local gardening competition one year, I think. I can imagine what it would have looked like though. The house itself is plastered a drab grey now, which is vastly different from what it would have looked like back in the day. There's a building to the left of the house that's abandoned now, but it used to be a little sweet store my gran ran. It was quite bizarre getting to see what was once my uncle's dairy farm and remembering how shiny and new the buildings were growing up when now they were mostly falling apart. I set up the Toyo there and took a 4x5 picture of what was once my uncle's farm and reflected for a bit. After that, I drove towards the coast along the road that we once took to drive over the dunes when that was something one could still do. My dad and I have been scheming for years now to figure out a way to walk over those dunes so that he can visit the place that they meet the ocean one last time. It's called Paardevlei and is one of the greatest fishing spots in the world, if my 6-year-old memory is to be trusted and the local stories to be believed. When I was really young, my dad took us to see the dunes on this road. And my brother and I wouldn't stop fighting, so he kicked us out of the car and said we could walk back to the farm if we wanted to fight and discuss it along the way. I think he left us to walk for like all of 10 minutes, but we thought we were going to get eaten by leopards or something and ended up sobbing our eyes out. And then he came back and it was the greatest moment of our lives. That's what I remember of this road. Cool bush though. After that bit of reflection and making another image or two, I started back towards Boknes. I stopped a couple of times to photograph places I remember my dad telling me about. Trees that used to have a teacher's farmhouse underneath them that he climbed growing up that were now just sentinels on the side of the road with bare earth beneath them again. And this farmhouse that I didn't know at the time but had actually been where my granddad lived at some point. As I was leaving the valley, I stopped for a couple of twilight landscapes. I started out with an image of this hill. And then turned around and saw the grass catching the last whispers of light on the other side of the road too. For some reason, I found myself drawn to making another torchlit image, so I ended up shining that into the grass for an option 2. I don't know. Torches shining into the darkness was a bit of a recurring theme on this trip, and looking back on it now, I don't know if it was because I felt that was a farmy thing or just because I felt like a large part of being out there was me searching for something and that an image with a torch in it was a good representation of that feeling. As night fell, I drove back to Boknes and started scheming the next day's adventure. Harke had invited me to come fishing with him and his friend Brad, who I hadn't met yet. I wasn't particularly interested in fishing, but the spot he was going to was another place where the dunes meet the ocean, and I figured maybe it'd scratch some of the Paardevlei itch for me. I got up eagerly the next day and once more headed to the milk stall at 5:30 a.m. to meet up with Harke and hear what his plan was with regards to the fishing. He told me to meet him at a parking lot at the end of Cannon Rocks at 9 a.m. It was around 6 a.m. at that stage, so I headed to the beach, made a couple of images, and by the time I was done photographing, I had to rush off to meet him because they ended up being there for 8:30 instead. Upon meeting them, I realized that I did in fact already know Brad, Harke's friend, which was really somewhat of a small world situation, but I'd met him before on set earlier in the year. He works in the art department, so we'd got to hang around each other in that context. I didn't know until I met up with him that morning just how serious Harke was about fishing, and I don't think Brad did either, to be honest. As I rolled up to the meeting spot, I saw one of those beach trolley things that I'd always thought were so intimidating, and I knew Harke knew what was up with the fishing business. After a brief drive and some time spent setting up the little beach cart, we went on a great track across the dunes to reach the fishing spot. It ended up being like an hour-long sand dune hike, and I was of course carrying my camera bag and wearing gumboots. The scenery was unreal though, and I photographed things frequently. After about half an hour of walking and photographing, I was a ways behind the guys since I was lagging behind making pictures. And as I looked to my left, I saw what looked like a house, mostly buried in a sand dune in the distance, and decided I'd like to go see what was going on there. I was a bit worried that Hark and Brad would think I'd gotten lost, and as I walked and walked, after a while I started to be a bit worried that I'd actually end up lost somehow, since where I was so vast and I was so alone. After what felt like forever though, I made it to the top of the outcropping that the house was sitting on, and got to see it up close. Turns out, it's a water pump building of some kind. The town's fresh water is sourced beneath these dunes. You can actually dig into the dunes near where they meet the ocean and find fresh drinking water, which is pretty cool. Anyway, I photographed the place and then headed back down, crossing over the path I'd made going up, which I quite liked visually. As I reached the ocean again, I saw some fire coral and photographed that. I walked a while longer and caught up with the guys just in time to catch a lesson in bait preparation. We spent a good few hours on that beach. I was mostly hanging out and making photographs, exploring the area, but Hark and Brad were fishing ferociously with not much luck. They did manage to catch and release pretty much everything that was in the water besides fish there though. I think they caught like 3 different kinds of shark each in that morning. As the day turned into afternoon, we decided to call it quits. The wind was picking up and there just didn't seem to be any fish in spite of the amount of effort that had been gone to in terms of walking there and setting up bait and picking the right spot, etc, etc. Sometimes that's just the way it is with fishing. As we walked back, Hark started joking about the fact that there had been a potential plan for them to camp there and me to walk back to Cannon Rocks along the beach, and that I should just go do that instead of driving back with them, since that had been the deal. That ended up being a recurring quip for the hour-long hike back, and eventually the hijinks between the 3 of us nearly had me crying from laughter, which didn't help with how out of breath I was from traversing the sand dunes again. The way the wind and the sand were interacting at this point was quite beautiful as well. I tried to photograph it a couple of times, but it didn't really work out the way I hoped. Sometimes a video can just capture things the way a still frame can't. Hark gave us a bit of a historical tour on the way out too, just to make up for the lack of fish. There are clumps of shells in the dune that one might not give a second thought unless you know what kinds of shellfish in the area are edible. As it turns out, these clumps are ancient dumping grounds the Khoi people used to get rid of shellfish they'd eaten. Quite cool. Hark also tried to find a fish fossil that his dad had shown him once when he was younger as we were leaving, but it seemed to have been overgrown, taken over by nature. Brad managed to find a similar one in the end though.
Quite a nice outline, eh?
Looks just like the real thing.
Millions of years to get there.
I parted ways with them once they dropped me back where I parked, and spent the rest of the day cruising around trying to scout out more places I remember from childhood but hadn't found yet. I made a couple of photographs, and then just as I was getting ready to make dinner at home, Hark asked me if I'd like to come over for a braai. So I spent the evening hanging out with him, and once I was socialized out, headed home and started making a list of things I still wanted to photograph. The following day, which was the first day that I had no reason to wake up at 5 a.m. since Hark was off doing his own thing, I was woken up at 5 a.m. by voices booming over loudspeakers. I had no idea what was going on, because up to that point, the only sounds I'd heard in the morning were maybe the odd dog barking and birds chirping, you know, normal, quiet beach town things. But the previous morning, before I'd gone on this fishing trip with Harki, I'd met a mom and her 2 sons and photographed them, and she'd mentioned that they were there for some sort of holiday camp thing. As it turned out, this holiday camp thing was a bit bigger than I had anticipated based on what she told me, and the reason there were voices booming over loudspeakers was because that's how they organized the hordes of children into doing things in the morning. Anyway, now that I'd been woken up by these loudspeakers, I decided I needed to go investigate what was going on. Whatever it was that was going on was huge. There were like 400 kids on the beach, and I felt very aware of myself with a camera, wandering around looking for images. It's just never a good look pointing a camera at kids, so I avoided doing that and photographed some sandcastle situations and a nondescript kid in the distance looking at the ocean, and decided to call it quits on the reflection of childhood memories vibe. I never really liked camps when I was younger anyway, so this wasn't necessarily part of my scope. I was still trying to scout out a house I'd stayed at once when I was really young, and as part of my search, ended up running into this troop of guys with a jeep thing of some kind. They scooted off into the village streets with a noisy exhaust and a slight aroma of weed after I'd photographed them. As I continued my quest for this house we'd stayed in once when I was younger, I ended up on a road where my dad had had a plot once upon a time. He'd bought it there before we moved to Tanzania, and it just ended up sitting there for like 10 years before being sold on. Someone's built a house on it now, and I photographed that place while remembering how my dad's dream had always been to have a log cabin of some kind there. I ended up driving around to Cannon Rockside, which didn't really have much to do with my project since I hadn't spent any of my youth there, but I made a photo of a cool building site tree situation and then ended up at the beach. With nothing distinct in mind to photograph, I decided to humor my inner child and mess around with something I would have found fascinating when I was younger. There's an outlet pipe for the desalination plant on the beach there where the overflow water is let out, and it's pretty much running day and night. I've actually photographed it before, but it does super interesting things in the sand with the path the water follows, likely because it's quite hard water, and I decided just to mess around with it for a couple of hours. I used to love playing with sand in water as a kid, and for some reason on this particular afternoon, doing just that felt like the right thing to be doing. Once I'd had my fill of the water games though, I got back in the car and headed back to Bogness. I ended up stopping to photograph a dune buggy that looked a lot like the ones my uncle used to build for powderflay, and spoke with the owner for far longer than anticipated about the intricacies of his dune buggy setup. As golden hour came on, I stopped to photograph another building site. I'd been thinking about the house my dad wanted to build that day, so I guess that's why I figured it could make for a relevant image. The site itself was quite bland, but the workers were leaving as I was lining up the shot and asked for a picture, so I was happy to oblige. That evening, I went and hung around Harki's farm some more in the dark to see if I could find a night scene and made an image I actually really like. I metered the flash so that it'd only light up the foreground and hopefully catch some reflectors on farm equipment in the back, and it worked out exactly the way I wanted it. I wanted it to feel closer to sort of what it's like to be out there with a torch than what it would look like if it were a fully flash blasted image, and it turned out just like that. Almost as soon as I made that image though, I heard thunder and saw lightning in the distance. And as I was standing there marveling it, thinking, wow, look at that so far away, a huge gust of wind almost knocked me off my feet, and the storm in the distance was suddenly right there. I scrambled for my car and got hounded by the dust as I headed home to hopefully beat the rain. This dust must have gotten into my car's fan belt or something because it started squeaking terribly, something that's been happening regularly now since that moment whenever dust blows into the engine bay. I made it home just as the heavy raindrops started falling and ended up sitting inside listening to a thunderstorm for the remainder of the evening. I was starting to reach the end of my allotted time that side of the world at this stage, and I was determined to make the most of what time I had left. After another 5 a.m. milk stall start to the day, I'd made some portraits of Harki and his dad, and was set to head to Alexandria to drive Boshoek with my uncle, since he'd have many more stories to tell about the place than I'd managed to remember my drive there a few evenings earlier. I reached the town earlier than I'd said I'd meet my uncle, and stopped by the church to make an image. My only context for this place is when we were there for my grand's funeral when I was 11. Because I'd reached town so early, I decided to cruise around for a bit and see what was going on. I photographed a hill that I knew my dad had fallen off his bike on when he was younger, since I'd seen the scar, and right next to that hill is the school he went to. I started off just photographing the outside, as the place was kind of falling apart and looked to be abandoned, but as I walked up the road alongside it, I noticed there was a car parked in the parking lot. So I went in to investigate. I decided to try my luck, since there was an open door, to see if I could get permission to photograph the space, and luckily for me, when I called out, someone answered, and they gave me permission. They said I could cruise around with the caretaker and send me off with him to go photograph the rugby field. I could not believe my luck. The reason I wanted to photograph these rugby poles was because Harki's dad had told me the story of why he remembered my dad so well. There had been a rugby tournament once, where it came down to a penultimate kick, a kick that could win the game for their team, and my dad was called in to make this kick, but his rugby shoes were slightly too big for him, so he lined it up, built a little mound of earth to set the ball on, ran in to take the kick, and as he kicked the ground and messed it up and lost the game for them. I think at the time, it probably wasn't very funny, but over the years, it's become a hilarious story to share, and I wanted to photograph those rugby poles. The picture itself, I suppose, is just a picture of some rugby poles, but given the context, I like the way it sits. As the groundskeeper was leading me out, I looked into the assembly hall and knew I had to make a photograph of it. I mean, My dad would have written his exams there, and it looked very similar to the school hall that I went to school in South Africa. So I set up the 4x5, and luckily the groundskeeper was quite interested in the whole 4x5 thing, so I just kept talking to him while I photographed this space that I hadn't necessarily been given full permission to photograph. And it was well worth it because it's probably one of my favorite 4x5 images from this trip. After that excursion though, I was a bit late to pick up my uncle, so I shot over there and headed to Borsuk with him. The light wasn't ideal at this stage, but I really wanted to know more about his understanding of the place, so we headed there anyway, in spite of the fact that I knew I wasn't particularly likely to be drawn to any of the scenes in this light. My uncle found it quite sad to see the places he'd spent so many years working on and building in the state of disrepair they were in now. He showed me houses he'd built alone from foundation up, and I imagined what it would be like to see the passage of time do that to something one had created. I was also more confident in just hopping over farmers' fences with him there, since, he'd farmed around there, he knew people, or had known people there, and, likely had a better idea of how to deal with a farmer's wrath than I would. So I photographed a house he'd built and what it looked like now, and a tree in a field adjacent. We cruised the rest of the valley that you've seen previously now, and I didn't make any other images. I just listened to stories of what my granddad was like, since I'd never met him because he died when my dad was 11. And before long, we were back in Alexandria, and I got treated to a very Afrikaans lunch. I photographed the jelly and custard dessert, since it was just too good to pass up, and after lunch I made portraits of my aunt and uncle, and then got to see some heirlooms. Now, I personally think it's pretty impressive that I've made it this far into a story involving a bunch of farming activity without talking about guns. I don't know what the international perspective on South African gun culture is like, but it's a thing here. It's not a thing the same way it is many other places. I mean, probably sits somewhere between like America and Switzerland, really, because we have some of the strictest laws in the world for gun ownership, and as a result, it's a great privilege to be able to own a gun. And they're used as tools on farms, I mean, the guns that I photographed here were tools that my granddad used to hunt for dinner because there weren't any grocery stores particularly nearby to reach without a car, So getting to see them was really special, and photographing them was really special. I photographed my granddad's hunting rifle, my uncle's revolvers, and my grandma's little pocket pistol thing. As I've said already, my granddad died when my dad was either 9 or 11, so I never got to meet him. But one of the few things I know about my granddad is the stories I've heard about how good he was with his hunting rifle, and his hunting rifle is something I've heard about for the duration of my entire life, but never got to see. So being able to see and photograph it was actually really special for me. Outside of what it is that the object itself represents, I think an heirloom like that is actually something quite beautiful, and the photograph itself is something I really enjoy, probably largely just for the fact that it's something special to me. After that though, it was time to head out. I said my goodbyes because I wasn't sure that I'd see them again before I headed back to Cape Town. I made a couple of photographs of the exterior of the home because that was the last time they were going to be living there, because they got into an age where they didn't want to live alone anymore. They were moving out. I made a 4x5 picture, and I intentionally have it out of focus. I promise it's intentional. None of the other ones where the focus is dodgy were intentional, but in this one, I wanted it to feel more like a distant memory than, a super clinical photograph. I mean, I made a Mamiya 7 picture, a super clinical Mamiya 7 picture that I'll show you here for comparison. But for me, I was really on this trip trying to make use of the fact that I have an intimate knowledge of photography at this point, and use techniques, even if they're not necessarily in the vein of making a proper clinical image, to really say what I was trying to say. So like with that picture earlier in the video where it was blurry because it was at 1/4 of a second, or this one where I intentionally back focused it, I'm happy with them. Having left my uncle's, the mission was to go drop off some parting gifts for the farmers, since I'd bought some whiskey for them earlier that morning. As I reached the farm, Hertjie's mom was in the garden with his nephews, and I gave her some flowers. The nephews were playing with a bourbal, Rafa, and I decided I wanted to try photograph him. At that moment, I realized I'd left my 90mm at my uncle's place. I made do with the 50mm and took the photographs I wanted to make, and then headed back for the hour-long drive to Alexandria to go pick up my 90mm lens. An hour or so later, as I reached Alexandria, the light was getting quite low in the sky, and I decided I'd stop by the graveyard again, as I'd done when I reached the town for the first time, to make a photograph of my grandparents' grave. It felt important for some reason, and I'm happy with how the image turned out. I suppose, in a way, it's a portrait of people that I can't make a portrait of anymore. After picking up the lens, I decided that if I'd come all this way again, I might as well take the scenic route back, so I decided to drive the Golden Mile in reverse. After all, I needed to try and make sure I'd gotten the picture I was going for when I was freaked out about getting eaten by a leopard. I stopped a couple of times along the way for some golden hour shots of farm scenes, just in case I hadn't gotten enough of those at this point. And when I reached the leopard scare tree, set up to remake things on medium format. Right, we're back here for round 2, the backup picture with the RB. Hopefully I can find the filter I was using before, because I think I kind of threw it in my haste to get out of here last time. Hopefully me freaking out last time when I heard grunting and stuff in the bushes is understandable given context. I mean, I'm about half an hour away from anything, and I've never seen anyone else driving on this road, so don't want to mess around with leopards and warthogs and that sort of thing. This camera actually smells delicious right now, because I took a couple of pictures at the chicory factory earlier, and the steam from the factorying got on it, and it really smells amazing. Okay, well, hopefully that worked out this time. I did 3 options just in case, because I think it's really quite a cool scene. Now we're going to continue on and see what we can find in that direction. I didn't know this at the time, but I'd somehow accidentally loaded Portra 160 in for this instead of Portra 400. Luckily, I err on the side of overexposure always, but you may notice that the colors look different to my usual colors here. As twilight fell, I drove on this marvelous road until I reached my favorite viewpoint and stopped to make a backup for the large format picture I'd made there previously. I ended up nuking this frame somehow, which isn't something I've done for quite some time, so I guess between the large format mishap and this frame, that viewpoint is a bit cursed. I snapped a shot of the view in the background in my side view mirror as I drove towards Borkness and darkness fell. I'd never driven this section of the Golden Mile in the dark before, and ended up stopping to photograph some fields which were nicely illuminated on the side of the road. One of them had cows in it, and the long exposure kind of gives me alien abduction vibes with the light and the blurry cows. I stopped once more, driving back, to make a long exposure of the dirt road illuminated by my car's headlights, since I realized driving this road in the dark that this would likely be one of the last opportunities I'd have to make an image of this experience that I'd been going through so many times on this journey, and I really like how it turned out. It's its own thing, you know, a dirt road at night, alone, and this picture represents it quite well for me. As I rolled into Borknes in the darkness, I passed by the buses that were in charge of ferrying around the horde of camp kids and wondered what they were up to that evening. The last day I was to spend in Borknes, I'd planned to spend mostly packing and organising things for the trip back. I got to the farm at 5:30, as always, and gave out a couple of thank you gifts in the form of whiskey for the time they'd let me spend there. As I was gearing up to leave, Harky asked if I'd like to cruise around with him some more, and my photographic brain completely obliterated all the thoughts of preparation that I'd been planning on doing for the trip back and said, of course I would like to cruise around with you some more. I brought my camera along in any case because I knew this was potentially something that would happen, and procrastinating on packing is something I do very well. A big part of being in this place for the past 2 weeks for me had been sort of trying to be a part of everyday life, and the way this manifested on the last day was getting to see him try to start up a Land Cruiser that had been standing a while for his dad. After getting the car running and giving it a quick rinse, Harky asked if I'd like to go see something interesting, the grave of a Xhosa prophet. This is the story of Nongqawuse. I won't try to go into too many specifics, since I'd likely butcher the intricacies of this story, likely in the same way I'm going to butcher some of the Xhosa words. But essentially, as it goes, Nongqawuse, who lived in the mid-1800s, had a vision where her ancestors told her that the Xhosa people needed to destroy their crops and kill their cattle. The ancestors told her that in return for this sacrifice, the European settlers would be swept out to the sea. A great many people believed the prophecy, and estimates are that around 300 to 400,000 cattle were slaughtered. In the end, the prophecy didn't come true, and initially its failure was blamed on the Xhosa people who had refused to slaughter their cattle. As a result of the famine that followed, the prophet was banished by the chief and lived with the major for a while before settling in Alexandria. Harky took me to where she was buried, and I made this image of the gravesite. After leaving that place, Harky dropped me back off at the farm, and I said my goodbyes and headed to see Henk the foreman. I couldn't say goodbye to him on the farm because he was on leave, so I headed to his farm. He was very grateful for the gift, although as it turned out, he didn't like whiskey and asked if I'd like to go shoot some gongs with him. I thought it might make for a good photo, so I was happy to accept, and took a couple of pictures of him and the rifles. He gave me a quick tour of his farm as the sun broke through the clouds near golden hour, and I made some images of a wheat field. And once I said my goodbyes, I headed home, took a picture of this beautiful road on his farm, and started packing. As I was getting ready to cook dinner, Harky sent me a message and asked if I'd like to come eat at them. So the procrastination continued, and I spent my last evening eating dinner with Harky, his family, and Brad. After dinner, I went home and packed up. The plan was to hit the road at 4 a.m, and I ended up getting into bed at around 12, I think. I woke up at 3:30, took the last few things I needed to pack down to the car, made sure everything that needed to be off around the house was off, and hit the road. Somehow, already, at 4 in the morning, there were scores of trucks on the road, which is never fun, but the first few hours of the drive flew by. I find driving in the dark feels somewhat less laborious since there are fewer landmarks to recognize and give context for distance traveled. The only time I really made images on the drive was when stuck at roadblocks. It was a beautiful day, thankfully, about as far a departure in weather as was possible for it to be from the first day of the trip. The roadblocks and recognizable landmarks made it feel like very slow going once the sun had risen though. Thankfully, there are plenty of beautiful things to see on the N2 along the garden route, and after 10 hours on the road, I arrived back in Cape Town. The first place I headed was the film lab to drop off film. I spent a couple of hours there chatting to folks since I consider them all my friends, and was very happy to be back talking to people that I knew once more. Not that I had a bad time out there, it's just, you know, being back home feels good. And I was quite wired after the drive, so once I'd had a few roles developed, I drove the final 15 minutes home. My trip was over. I think this trip is probably going to end up being one of the more important things I do in my adult life. I mean, it's been a greatly refreshing thing to have done now, just because it's the first time that I've gone since I was sick out and done something of this nature. And as much as it was a struggle to be alone and cold for that period of time, the body of work that is shaping up here, I think, has the potential to be something really special. And it also sort of answered some of my questions about my heritage, but also left me with more questions, really, because the fact that the generalization of the culture that I come from proved to be somewhat inaccurate sort of makes me wonder why exactly it's still a thing, you know? Which isn't to say there aren't still elements of South African society which are questionable, but I think those elements exist across the board and can't really be placed on one specific culture or subculture, to be honest. It's not really something that one can go into particularly deeply in a YouTube video, I don't think, but I do have some words from the photographer Peter Hugo in his 2014 book Kin, which I think sum things up quite succinctly. About 8 years ago, I started photographing the notion of home, whatever that might mean, as both intimate and public place. To look at home critically is to look at oneself and one's fellow man. It is to feel the weight of history and to consider the space one occupies in it. It is to consider one's relationship with kin, to look at the tenuous ties that bind us to and repel us from each other. Home is where belonging and alienation coexist. Does this belonging liberate or confine us? Does it tie us to the terrible weight of history or free us from it? I have deeply mixed feelings about being here. 8 years on, I do not feel any more resolved about the issues. If anything, I am more confused and more at odds with my home. This work grapples with these dilemmas, but ultimately fails to provide any answers. Anyway, that passage sort of made what I was feeling in my mind make sense a bit more, because at the end of the day, the idea of South African history and its questionability isn't something that one person can answer, and it's more about experiencing things and seeing what results. And I guess I'm just very lucky that I ended up on the mellowest farm in all of South Africa with the coolest dude, because Harky really is an amazing person that I'm very lucky to have met and can call my friend now. And yeah, I mean, this hasn't been a short video. Hopefully, if you've stuck around, you've enjoyed what it shaped up to be at this point. I wanted it to be a journey, and I kind of figured that if folks were interested in the journey, they'd watch a longer thing rather than splitting it into series, because if it was in parts, it wouldn't feel as if you'd been there with me, which is sort of the way I want this video to feel. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you got something out of this. A monumental thank you, as always, to the members of my Buy Me a Coffee for making this possible. There really aren't words to thank you for the fact that I got to do this. I'm of plan to go back in the near future, and the plan after that would be to go to East Africa, since, I mean, I'm interested in exploring more of this sort of heritage idea, and I suppose one's heritage isn't really necessarily that which your family comes from, but rather the summation of your lived experience. And to me, my lived experience is in all sorts of places around Africa, as opposed to growing up in one culture. And I reckon if I manage to turn this into a project, then the next step would be to go to East Africa. And in terms of general traveling, at some point in the future, once things have lined up for it, I'm going to come to America. I've made up my mind. I want to go see what's going on there and meet all those large format wielding photographers like Brian Burks. Anyway, I'll see you soon. As things peter out here, I'd just like to take a moment to thank my lab, Cape Film Supply, once more for the amount of effort they've gone to in developing these things for me to scan, because 4x5 film is quite tricky to get developed in South Africa, and being able to do that at all was marvelous. A big thank you to Chris and CJ for that, and Michael for facilitating, and to Liam, MJ, Nick, Joe, and anyone else who I might have forgotten who works in the lab but I'd consider friends. And a major thank you to Harky, Henny, Hank, and everyone else on the farm for being as accommodating as they were to me and letting me make these pictures. And lastly, you, whoever it is that's still sitting here listening to this, because it's been quite a long video, so thank you so much.